Dear friends, now it's time for the third presentation on the second coming. And as I said, this is a must to understand that, because these texts are clear, very, very clear. And with that concept, we're going to go to the book of Revelation soon. And the reason is, of course, very simple. Jesus is the author of the book of the Bible. There is no confusion built in. What he says clearly in the Gospels, and Paul says in other places in the New Testament, must be the same message as we find in the book of Revelation. So we have gone over the different aspects, everything from Jesus' parables, his unexpected coming, glorious appearing, everyone will see him, etc. And now it's time to do the PowerPoint presentation where we put the Gospels side by side, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And by doing so, we'll enhance our understanding significantly. And that's what we need. Many have studied Matthew alone. And of course, that's good. But only when we put them together, all three, we get the full view of the three synoptics. So let's start with the PowerPoint presentation. So here it comes, the three Gospels side by side. And what we're going to see here is the three Gospels, as I said. What I want to do is to read the Gospels side by side. That means I call it read horizontally. So let's start and see how it goes. Matthew 24, verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was walking away with his disciples, came up to him and to call his attention to the buildings. And the same thing pretty much Mark says, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. And Luke agree with it. The temple was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God and so on. And then when we come to verse 2, then Jesus starts talking. Do you see all these things? He asked. I tell you the truth. Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. And if you go now look at Mark, verse 2, the same thing. When you see all this, not one stone will be left on another. Everything will be thrown down. And it's almost identical in the verse 6 in Luke also. So that means this was a hard message for them to understand, because as long as the temple existed, they felt that the world was still okay. And when the temple, by any chance, would be destroyed, that would be sort of the end of the world. So let's continue and see. In verse 3, Matthew 24, they went now over to the Mount of Olives, and it says here, the disciples came to him privately. And we don't know who they are in Matthew, but it doesn't matter, because when we go to Mark, it says the same thing. They were sitting on Mount Olives, and there Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately. Good, extra information. If you go to Luke, it's just a little dash there. So Luke did not mention that. But when we continue and go to the question, then we go back to Matthew verse 3 again, the last part. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of the coming and the end of the age? Here you see, the end of the age. That was for them the total and last disaster. And when they refer to the when, then he's talking about the temple and its building, not one stone left upon another. If you go to Mark, verse 4, the same thing. When? What will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled? You see, he doesn't draw the same conclusion as Matthew did. Matthew said at the end of the age, but Mark talked about being fulfilled. So here we can see, even under inspiration, we remember or put our attention to different things. So Matthew did one thing, end of age. Mark, when will it be fulfilled? And there Luke says pretty much the same thing. When and what will be the signs that they are about to take place? So with these first verses, you can see how they are very similar, but we get some extra information, and we will get more later on. Let's continue. Jesus answered. Let me just put this up here so we can read. Watch out that no one deceives you. And Mark says the same thing. No one deceives you. And Luke also that no, you are not deceived. No difference. Verse 5. For many will come in my name claiming I am the Christ and will deceive many. And Mark says pretty much the same thing. I am he, of course, then referring to Christ, and will deceive many. And Luke, the same thing. I am he, the time is near. But Jesus said clearly, do not follow them. And then he goes on. You will hear wars and rumors of wars, but don't be alarmed. Before I continue, what is Jesus now going to talk to us about? That not one stone will be left upon another. So we need to check that, to have that in our mind all the time. Let's continue verse 6. Such things must happen, wars and rumors of wars, but the end is still to come. Or other versions, right, it is not yet there. If you go to Mark, when you hear wars and so on, the same thing, do not be alarmed, but the end is still to come. And Luke, very similar, wars and revolutions, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. Very good. They all have some small variations. And we continue in verse 7 in Matthew. Nations will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Yeah, this sounds really bad. Mark has identical pretty much the same sentence. And Luke, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and so on. No significance different, no extra knowledge either for us yet. Then they continue. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and Mark does the same thing, and Luke is a little bit more detailed there. Earthquakes, famines, pestilences, fearful events, and great signs from heaven. And that's okay. That's what we need to know, get all the facets of the truth. Verse 8, this is the beginning of the birth pains. And Mark the same thing. And here Luke doesn't write anything. Verse 9, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. And you will be hated by all nations because of me. I've underlined here you because you're going to see later on he talks about they or other people. But here you, the disciples, you will be hated and so on. And Mark, pretty much the same, but a little bit more. You must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. Very typical for their time, isn't it? On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. For example, Paul did that. And Luke says, but before all this, they will lay hands on you and persecute you. They will deliver you to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors, the same as Mark. and all on the account of my name. This will result in you being witnesses to them. Very interesting, very helpful. We are on the right track. So far, he hasn't talked anything about any other topic. We're still talking about not one stone left upon another. Now it comes to, we go to Mark 10, the middle section. And that is the only one verse that is not identically placed as the other ones. So when we come to Matthew 14, I will remind you about that again. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. And Luke didn't say anything about that. And when we go to Luke, we go to verse 14, but make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves. And Mark says exactly the same thing. Do not worry before. Why? Jesus has the answer too. Just say whatever is given you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Excellent. And I'm sure that's exactly what Jesus said. Verse 15 in Luke, for I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. So it just continues about the bad times Jesus is talking about now. Let's go over to verse 10 in Matthew. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray many. And the word betray you can find also in verse 12. Brothers will betray brother to death and father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Wow, that's not fun. Sounds really bad and sad. 16 in Luke, you will be betrayed even by parents, brothers, relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death. The same message. And in verse 10, the left one, when it comes to Matthew, and hate each other. And Mark the same, all men will hate you because of me. And the same thing in Luke. So this is really rough times. That's no question about it. The question is still when. And when they ask when will it happen or what will be the sign, and we're going to soon find out when that will come up. Let's take Matthew 11 and 12 also. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. And Mark and Luke do not say anything about that. Let's do the next verses and see if we can have a defining moment. Okay. Let me see if I can move this away. So then we have to go to Luke verse 18, but not a hair of your head will perish. And then they all three said, but those who stand firm to the end will be saved. Again, the end, we need to know what he's talking about. He's still talking about not one stone left upon one other. And Mark says the same thing here in the middle. And Luke pretty much the same thing. By standing firm, you will gain life. Now in verse 15, you see they all start with when. So Jesus has when and what. So now we're going to see what Jesus' answer is to the question. 15 in Matthew. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet of Daniel, let the reader understand. Oh my goodness. Even today, hardly anyone knows what that means. And remember when this here, because very soon I'm going to tell you what happened in AD 70. Good. Let's go to Mark. When you see the abomination that causes desolation, he doesn't mention the word Daniel, standing where it doesn't belong. Let the reader understand. Okay, that is also quite hard to understand. But listen now what Luke says. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Do you see? The clarity here is immense. Matthew and Mark, they thought right away about some prophecies in the book of Daniel. But Luke says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and we know that referred to AD 70. It didn't happen way before Christ came. No, this is in the future, after Christ's ministry on the earth, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. And you know what happened when in AD 70 Jerusalem was surrounded by the armies, and just of a sudden all the armies left. And some say it's about 3 days. Those inside Jerusalem did not see them. But listen now what Jesus said. Because historically we also know that those who were obedient to Christ's advice were saved. So what does he say next? Verse 16 in Matthew to the left. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Judea. The land of Israel. Those in Jerusalem. Mark says the same thing. Identical. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and look exactly the same. And you can imagine that now it's busy and it's actually deceptive, because wouldn't you, like me, if I was standing there and just all of a sudden the armies disappeared, wouldn't you rejoice and say, wonderful, great, they gave up, God saved us, or whatever they said? But listen now what comes in verse 17 in Matthew to the left. He will show us how important it is to hurry and not to drag. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. And Mark says the same thing. And Luke is a little bit shorter. Let those in the city get out. And now he'd speak also to those in the field. Verse 18 to the left in Matthew, let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. Mark identically. And Luke says, and let those in the country not enter the city. You see, the urgency is there. Flee to the mountains. The armies withdrew for a few days. Let's see what comes next. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. And let me move this. And then the same thing with the Mark. Dreadful for the pregnant women and nursing mothers. And Luke's is identical to the right. Then Matthew and Mark have some extra comments which Luke does not have. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. That indicates, by the way, that Sabbath was still important for them during that time. 70 AD. And pray that this will not take place in the winter, says Mark, and Luke nothing, and that's okay. And to me, it's amazing. If this all refers to AD 70, which I strongly believe, even in a time of wrath, God answers prayer to be graceful to those who are praying for him. For example, pray that it will not happen in winter. Well, then it must be come later in the spring or summer or on the autumn, I don't know, and not during the Sabbath. So let's go on here, because now we get a lot of information more. Matthew to the left, for there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never be to be equaled again. Did you hear what I read? For there will be great distress, unequal from the beginning of the world until now, 70 AD, and never to be equaled again. Well, you say there's only one? Yeah, let's go to Mark. Because those in the middle, but because those will be days of distress, unequaled from the beginning, when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Take that to heart, dear friends. If this is fulfilled in AD 70, we're going to see very close, and we already seen many indications for that. It will never be equaled again. Do you think God is promising? We can trust God in His promises? Of course we can. And that's what I've gone through. The Bible text, no wrath for the saved ones. Let's see what Luke says. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. That is the Jewish nation. That's the old covenant people. Wrath against these people. And for those of you interested in more, you have to go to Deuteronomy and check there the places where God's blessings on the covenant people and God's curses on covenant people. All dependent on how the covenant people behave. But here, Luke is writing it down, what Jesus said. He was the one who very carefully investigated what Jesus had said. And listen to what it says in verse 24 in Luke, and the others don't mention it. That means that these people, the Jewish nation, they will fall by sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. That's diaspora. And that happened in AD 70. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. I believe that time lasts until Jesus comes back. But at least otherwise you have to prove from the Bible if the Gentiles' time are fulfilled earlier. But I believe that's the end, Jesus' second coming. Until Jesus comes back, the diaspora will be there. But then you say, well, we have a Jewish state as a nation since 1948. That is correct. But you can go on any dictionary and just look up the current population of Jews in Israel and how many there are outside Israel. And every time I look at it in different books, the same, the majority are still spread out in the world. But remember again, this is not against the Jewish people. This against the Christians as well who were in the city of Jerusalem in AD 70. And pretty much every one of them were of Jewish nation. So that's about them. But this is a covenant curse you can read about in Deuteronomy. So let's continue and see, because now this is a hard message. Let's go over and see what the Lord has more to say. And we know that when the Roman again came back and was around the city for maybe a year or more, it was very, very tough times. And remember now, only the faithful one had escaped Jerusalem. Those who did not trust in Jesus' word, they are probably still inside. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. And Mark says the same thing. And Luke nothing. Now it comes very close to when Jesus is going to come and start talking about the second coming. At that time, if anyone says to you, still talking about the AD 70, look, here is Christ, or there he is, do you not believe it? And Mark says very much exactly the same. Verse 24 in Matthew to the left. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles and deceive even the elect. Verse 22, false Christ and so on. No difference. Exactly the same. And both add then if that were possible. So listen now what Jesus is about to say. See, I've told you ahead of time. And the same thing in Mark, nothing in Luke. So we all know when the prophecy is told beforehand, when it's there fulfilled, we know that's the time. And listen now when Jesus is coming here, saying to them. So if, verse 26, so if anyone tells you, his believers, there he is out in the desert, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. Why? Because that was a fact. There was many false Christs and prophets during these times. And they wanted to deceive as many as possible. So now, what happened? They actually come and see Christ. He's over here or he's over there. It's like the second coming. Someone will say, look, I'm watching a TV and Jesus has come back. No, everyone will see him. All eyes will see him. So don't believe in it. That's wrong. So the same thing here. So if anyone tells you, we're going to the desert, no, don't go there. And here he is in the inner rooms. No, don't even go in there either. Why? And now you can realize how important it is for Jesus to tell what to look for in contrast to these false prophets, to what the real thing is about. Are you ready? I put this in blue, the contrast. For he's answering to what he said before. As the lightning that comes from east is visible even in the west, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. So the real thing is like this. Don't believe those who say go into the desert to the inner rooms and visit Christ. And verse 28 in Matthew, wherever there's a carcass, there the vultures will gather. We skipped it right now. We talked about it earlier. And then it goes on in verse 29. And here I have some words in bracket, and I had to, because here the translators like to a little bit make it a slant to one side or the other. So says Matthew in this version, immediately after the distress. But literally it says soon, but after the distress. The word soon, as Jesus used over and over again in Revelation and everywhere about the second coming. So soon can easily be 2,000 years, by the way. So soon, but after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give his light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Well, that's exactly what we read. And we read at that time. Let's read what Mark is saying. But in those days, no, the exact words are contrariwise to this, the days following that distress. So the time frame there in between is not mentioned at all in any one of them. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall, and the heavenly bodies will be shaking. Pretty much identical. Let's go over to Luke. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. Yes. Nations will be in anguish. Yes, we've studied about that. You will see that when you come to the book of Revelation. The anxiety and the fear when they see Jesus coming out of the clouds on the mountains. Because in verse 27, in Matthew to the left top, we talked about as the lightning goes all over the sky, everybody will see him. But the anguish will be there, and Luke is describing it very accurately. And perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea and the sky. Well, that belonged to the other line there. I'm sorry. So this word sky came over from here by mistake. So excuse me, I will correct it for the next presentation. But then Luke continue. Men will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world. You can see that he adds the reaction to the people. And now he says, talk about men. He doesn't talk about you. The living saints at his coming. And then he continues with the heavenly bodies as the Matthew and Mark did. You can see again, Jesus had to contrast the false prophets who say, come to the inner rooms and go out in the desert. No, everybody will see it. It's universal signs. No one can miss it. That's why we need to know the Bible text about the second coming. Let's go on. At that time, the signs of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And the Mark says pretty much the same thing, just a little bit shorter. And when we move this down here to also, you can read Luke. At that time, they will see the Son of Man coming in cloud with power and great glory. And here, if you go back to verse 30 to the left, again, you see they, and Mark wrote men, but another version says they here also. So I will not argue about that, but he does not use you, and Luke says they also. And then Matthew and Mark add something more. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from the end of the heavens to the other. And Mark, very similar, gather the elect from the four winds and the four corners of the earth, and so on. But Luke mentions nothing. And now the next verse that comes is verse 28 in Luke. And I think that's not belongs to this contrast picture he put in. And you will again see that this concept of this is a contrast will be again proven in the next couple of verses. So Luke writes, when these things begin to take place, stand up and lift your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. And here is a non-specific. I think it can fit both to the second coming and to what happened in AD 70, but I don't know for sure, so I put it in black as the rest of my text is. So let's go on now and see how it continues. Now I have here on top also, let's move this up here. I have this again the same which I had before, so you know I'm not jumping over anything. Now, let's go to verse 32 to the left in Matthew. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves comes out, you know that the summer is near. And Mark says pretty much the same. Fig tree leaves, you know that summer is near. And Luke in 29 to 30, fig tree leaves, and you can see for yourselves and know that the summer is near. Okay, quite general. Could potentially be for both AD 70 and the second coming, but you will see one more thing come. That's been troubling to many, many theologians and pastors and so on, priests. Verse 33 to the left, even so, when you see all these things, you know that is near, right at the door. And Mark, so exact it can be, and Luke, the same thing, no difference. And now it comes, verse 34 in Matthew to the left. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. And I see the same text, you can see the same text in verse 30 in the middle in the Mark, and the same thing in Luke. They really wrote it down as clear and exact as they could. And you don't know what a big problem this place has been for the theologians and pastors. Why is Jesus saying within this generation it will happen? A generation in those days, in Bible times, was considered to be 40 years. And for example, if Christ died on the cross in 31 AD, it is within 40 years, because 70 is then 39 years after that. So within a generation, all these things will happen. Mark, Luke, Matthew, they all say the same thing. With this understanding I'm giving you now, it all falls into place. And every single text we studied before about the second coming fits well, perfectly, to say. And one more verse, and then we're done with this presentation. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. He put his guarantee there to what he has said. And we have 3 witnesses who have written it down. We can certainly be sure about it. Heaven and earth will pass away, says Mark, but my words will never pass away. And Luke, the same too. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Do you understand that? Do you want to grasp it to your heart? Do you remember what you read before? And will not be equaled again, the distress, the bad things that happened during AD 70, when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. It will not come back. And his words are true. And Jesus is the one who has authored and given all the information to John in the book of Revelation. So now you can see, up to this point, I find no indication that this is about the second coming. Yes, the contrasting part, but that was to make sure they did not miss the most important deception they could have. And if a false prophet would come and say, he is in the desert, or he is in the inner rooms, go there. No, no, no. Flee to the mountains and stay there until it's over. So that is the last presentation I have there for this PowerPoint. I hope it's been very rewarding to you. And with this understanding, with these 3 presentations, actually you would be able to understand the book of Revelation yourself, because then you would stand on firm ground. But still, I've done the presentations and the lectures will follow. So thank you for listening. God bless you.